In this video, we're going to talk about minimum wage. Now, minimum wage is a fairly recent concept. Now, I say fairly recent in the grand scheme of history. But if we want to understand our current situation, we need to take a little bit of a step back. But before we do that, minimum wage came about in 1938. 1938 was the year that FDR, this guy right here, signed the Fair Labor Standards Act. But before we talk about the details of the Fair Labor Standards Act, I want to go back and talk about what led up to it. Between the mid 1700s to the mid 1800s, we had an industrial revolution. And what this meant was that factories were being built, products were being produced at a much faster rate than ever before, and that people were migrating to cities in order to fill jobs. There was a promise of better wages. And so people flooded into cities and started working for factories rather than in the agricultural sector of the economy. But cities were not equipped to handle all of these migrants. And so we had much disease and housing shortages and pollution and all sorts of stuff. And when factories started to come about, the people who owned the factories prized production and profits over worker safety and even over worker wages and the ages of workers. So many of the workers in the factories at that time were children. Many people in factories labored 14 to 16 hours a day and didn't always get paid wages that were sufficient to live a comfortable life. And so, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, you began to have tension between employers and employees. This tension hadn't really existed too much up to this point, but it began to be a very significant thing within our society. You started to have strikes and the labor movement began. And so, as we go throughout time, as we move forward in time, we get to 1898. Right at the end of the 19th century. And in 1898, a guy by the name of Samuel Gompers, this dude right here, Gompers founded the American Federation of Labor. He was a proponent of unions and believed that people should be able to come together to seek their own self-interest as employees, as laborers. So in 1898, Samuel Gompers wrote a piece called A Minimum Living Wage, and it was published in the American Federationist publication. And in it, I draw your attention to this piece here that I've highlighted. He says that when the workman receives in return for his labor sufficient to sustain himself and those dependent upon him, in a manner to maintain his self-respect, to educate his children, supply his household with literature, with opportunities to spend a portion of his life with his family, he not only becomes an honor to the community in which he resides, but everyone in his immediate neighborhood benefits thereby. So, Gompers was one that said, we need a minimum living wage. Not just a minimum wage, but a minimum living wage. Now, today, we have many discussions going on about minimum wage, but that is not necessarily a piece of it. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So, 1898, Gompers is advocating for a minimum living wage. We have yet to see a minimum wage come into existence. So what happens next? In 1912, Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts enacts the first minimum wage law. In 1923, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a decision, in a case called Adkins versus the Children's Hospital of D.C., the Supreme Court rules that imposing a minimum wage violates the rights of workers and employers, their ability to make their own decisions and come to an agreement. And so it violates what's called the liberty of contract. And so they strike it down. They say minimum wage is unconstitutional. And so no more minimum wage. But time goes on. And eventually we get to 1938. So between 1923 and 1938, what's going to happen? So in the early 1930s, FDR, newly elected president, in the midst of the Great Depression, desires to have workers get out of the situation that they're in. People are suffering because of the Great Depression, and he wants to try to get their situation improved. And so he pushes for a couple different things. He pushes for the National Industrial Recovery Act. He allows industries to enforce their own trade codes and raise wages. The cotton industry does this, sets a minimum weekly wage, and it decides to abolish child labor. In 1935, the Supreme Court says that these codes and minimum wages are unconstitutional. And so, in the 1936 election for president, minimum wage is a big issue. It's something that FDR wants to try to get pushed through. In 1937, in what's known as the Big Switch, the Supreme Court of the United States upholds a minimum wage law from the state of Washington. It's known as the Big Switch because here in 1937, they were basically saying that minimum wage laws do not violate the Constitution, when over the past many years, they had repeatedly said that they do violate the U.S. Constitution. And so with this victory from the Supreme Court, 1937, so in 1938, Congress passes the Fair Labor Standards Act. It requires a federal minimum wage of a whopping 25 cents per hour. I assume you're glad that that's not still the federal minimum wage, but that's what it was in 1938. This passage was not without controversy. In his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein has this to say about the federal minimum wage. It says, during this time, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal first with industry codes and then with the Fair Labor Standards Act, prohibited child labor and established minimum wages of about $12 a week in the South, rising to 25 cents an hour in 1938. But to pass such economic legislation, Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern congressmen and senators, who agreed to support economic reform only if it excluded industries in which African Americans predominated, like agriculture. So even though the federal minimum wage was passed and established a minimum wage, it was not a minimum wage for everyone. So one of the reasons that the minimum wage is still very controversial is that the minimum wage doesn't automatically adjust for rising cost of living. It was set originally at 25 cents per hour. It has increased over time since then, but it is completely dependent upon politicians. And so the minimum wage, being completely dependent upon politicians, basically means that it's completely dependent upon who is in power and who has power. If people in power, politicians, if those in power do not wish to see the minimum wage increased, then it won't be. And if those in power do want to see it increased, and they're able to do it, well, then maybe it will be. But it's all together up to politicians. Now, I want to take a minute and return to Samuel Gompers. Gompers, again, writing in 1898, long before we get to the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act for a minimum wage, wrote a piece again entitled A Minimum Living Wage. Now, a living wage is what he advocated for. Again, if we look at what he wrote, in part he said, "When the workman receives in return for his labor sufficient to sustain himself and those dependent upon him in a manner to maintain his self-respect, to educate his children, supply his household with literature, with opportunities to spend a portion of his life with his family, he not only becomes an honor to the community in which he resides, but everyone in his immediate neighborhood benefits thereby." Now, Gompers again was calling for a minimum living wage. He advocated that if you worked a 40-hour work week, or whatever might be considered at that time a good, regular, honest work week, that you would be able to educate your children and have a family, that you would be able to supply your household with literature, to be able to enjoy the things that make life worth living. Things like the arts and literature, plays, film, going out into nature, and having an opportunity to spend a portion of your life with your family so that you can enjoy those things. If that's the case, Gompers says that that person, that man in his frame here, that man will be able to be an honor to his community, and that his society and those around him will benefit as a result. Now, do we have a minimum living wage today? I don't think anyone would argue with me when I would say that we do not. Currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and that was set in 2009. If someone works what we consider a regular 40-hour work week and works for an entire year, this basically equates to $15,000. per year. Now, is that a living wage? Probably not very feasible to raise a family of any reasonable size on $15,000 a year. I'm sure that there are people who struggle and who do it, but would that person or that individual be able to accomplish the things that Gompers was arguing for? And I don't think so. What does this really mean in terms of our society? If you look at Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, recently Bob Iger made $65,600,000 was his salary or his earnings. Now, this can often come in different ways and shapes for CEOs, but generally speaking, this is his compensation. Okay? Now, most people know Disney. Not hard to figure out. And you see Mickey Mouse on anything from a Cardinals hat, best baseball team there is, or if you know Disney from movies like The Avengers, as Disney owns Marvel Studios, they also own a little bitty franchise that deals with this kind of stuff. So, Disney's got a lot of things going on. But Bob Iger's salary of $65.6 million is kind of crazy. Now, people say minimum wage, hey, we should raise it. Can we afford to raise it? Can we afford to pay a minimum living wage? Well, let's just take Bob Iger's example here. If Disney has any employees that are paid minimum wage, federal minimum wage, what's the difference between those individuals and Bob Iger? Is Bob Iger paid what he is worth? Or any CEO for that matter? Well, when we talk about worth, what are we really talking about? What a person is worth is not accurately reflected by how much compensation they receive. If we think that that's the case, well, then we need to rethink the way things work. Because I would argue that a teacher who makes $40,000 a year actually provides greater societal benefit than, say, a baseball player who makes $20 million a year. Or a hedge fund manager who moves around other people's money. Now, what societal benefits are we receiving from these people's wages and these people's efforts? What worth are they? What worth do they have? Well, I believe all people have the same amount of worth as human beings. But the way we provide funds to them based on what they do doesn't really line up with what they are worth. And that needs to have a much longer discussion. But for the sake of this example, let's look at this contrast. Again, if Disney had employees who were paid minimum wage, $15,000 a year, and that minimum wage is represented by this piece of paper from a book. Now, I'm a big bibliophile. I love books, but this book page kind of fell out, so I don't mind using it for this example. But if this is $15,000 a year, if that one page is equal to $15,000 a year, what does Bob Iger's salary look like? How many pages would we need? We would need all of the pages in these books. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems kind of crazy. Now, you might say, well, we can't take away money from people like Bob Iger and give it to others. That's redistribution. That's stealing or theft. But the problem is that we have conditioned ourselves to believe that what Bob Iger has earned is what he deserves for what he does. Now, someone, the board of directors, sets his salary and every other CEO's salary. And all I'm arguing is that compensation for everyone in this country really needs to be reconsidered. We need to take some more time to have discussions, to talk about what is reasonable. If someone works 40 hours a week, breaking their back or their hands or their knees or their wrists and elbows, doing hard manual type labor, they should be able to afford to support a family and to do those things that Samuel Gompers argued for. But today, someone working full-time at a minimum wage job, that's not going to happen. So, enough of my soapbox. The Fair Labor Standards Act applies to companies unless they fall into these different categories here. We have what's called the enterprise test. The enterprise test is based on gross annual sales. Now, to determine whether the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to your company or not, you need to know when your company began operations. Did your company begin operations before March 31st of 1990 or after March 31st of 1990? If it was before March 31st of 1990, and you are a retail or a non-retail business, and your sales were $326,500 or more annual, $250,000 or more annual, then the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to you. If your sales were less than those amounts, then it did not. If you were a dry cleaner, construction company, a school, a hospital, or a nursing home, your sales were greater than zero, it applied to you. If you began operations after March 31st of 1990, then some different values come into play. If you are a retail, non-retail, dry cleaner, construction company, and your sales were more than $500,000, Fair Labor Standards Act applies. And again, like the old rules, if you're a school, hospital, or nursing home, then anything over zero means that the Fair Labor Standards Act applies. So, a couple different things here that we need to talk about, or at least one thing. What if you started before 1990, but under these new rules, you don't meet the $500,000 requirement? So, if you fail the new test, what do? Well, if you fail the new test and you're one of these companies that started before 1990, then you still have to apply by Fair Labor Standards old regulations. So there are a little bit of differences here, but this is what's called the enterprise test. And so there are some companies that fit into these categories that may not have to follow the minimum wage and overtime and whatnot from Fair Labor Standards Act. In addition, if you are a mom and pop shop, you do not necessarily have to follow the Fair Labor Standards Act. A mom and pop shop is a family-owned enterprise that only employs family members. You can also get a special certificate from the Department of Labor that can allow you to be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And outside salespersons are also exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, we need to have a discussion about federal law versus state law. Federal law has a minimum wage, but many states also have minimum wages. If they're different, for example, if federal law, which says minimum wage is $7.25, You just state that your N says minimum wage is $8.25. Well, then guess what? The state wins. Whatever is more favorable for the employee. Whichever law is more favorable for the employee, that is the law that applies. States also have the authority to put requirements on the frequency of payments, the final wages paid to someone who's terminated, the methods of payment, and over unclaimed wages. So if an employee does not cash their paycheck, what are the rules that the corporations or businesses have to abide by? And this is called escheat law, and these are really the purview of states. Now, even when FLSA applies, companies are not required to pay minimum wage or sometimes overtime to a few groups of people. If you have tipped employees, they are allowed to be paid $2.13 per hour, but they must meet the minimum wage requirements overall. So with their tips included, they must still make the minimum wage. Computer professionals, if they're paid $27.63 per hour or more, they can be exempt from the overtime requirements. And for those who qualify for the opportunity wage, these are new employees less than 20 years old who qualify. They can be paid $4.25 per hour for the first 90 consecutive days. But the employer can't hire these particular workers to reduce their payroll costs. In other words, they can't get rid of people for the purpose of hiring these folks so that they can pay them less. Now, this pretty much sums up our discussion of the federal wage and hour laws.